I found out
Look at that.
later on just how devastating
Children
it was.
decided it was time for mother and father.
My name is Neil Piper. I serve on the trustees here at this church and live in Gorham. And my connection to New Sweden is kind of circuitry a little bit. I used to live in Aroostook County. My wife Connie's here with me. We lived up there for 30 years in Presque Isle. So we've been looking at Facebook and looking at all the snowstorms that have been up there and the whiteouts and the snowbanks. And familiar with that. We used to have some winters like that. We haven't had any up there in a long time, but this year they're really getting a big winter. And the other part of New Sweden that we found interesting is Connie's parents were of Swedish descent, and their parents, which would be our grandparents, basically came from New Sweden and immigrated here in the 1920s. They were about 1919, 1920. They immigrated here, and he was the farm manager for the Ram Island Farm in Cape Elizabeth. If any of you have heard of the Spragues and the Ram Island Farm, he was the farm manager down there during that period of time. And we found a lot of Swedish things, and we have a lot of Swedish traditions we maintain. So when we lived in Presque Isle, we did a lot of time going up to New Sweden and seeing some of their ceremonies and visiting their museum, and it's a very interesting little town to go to. And I'll tell you a little bit of how that town started and how people got there. And one of the things that I was doing with this program when I was putting it together, because I was doing a little history project, is that this is really a story of migration. And we've had a theme in the church in the last couple months about migration and immigrants and so forth. Well, New Sweden Colony was an organized effort by the state of Maine to get people to migrate to an uncharted area of Maine at that point. And I can tell you a little bit about the history of that. But anyway, that's going to be tied in as a theme through this little presentation. In the economy, the reason people immigrated to the United States from Sweden is that between 1867 and 1914, after the Civil War period, Sweden was going through an economic depression, and there was not a lot of opportunity, and people were having a hard time making a living up there in the population. So they had immigration coming from Sweden at quite a heavy rate. You hear about the Italians and the French and all the other people, and the Irish that all came here. Well, there was a large number of Swedish people that immigrated to the United States. The records that I could find said about 37,000 a year came to the United States during that 30, 40-year period. So there was quite a few came. A majority of them went to Minnesota, Illinois, Kansas. If you've ever seen Little House on the Prairie, that's all about Swedish families in Minnesota. You know, the Engels family and Olsons that ran the store and that kind of stuff on Little House on the Prairie. That's where a lot of them went. But at this point in time, there was also a few that they got to come to Aroostook County, and this is a story about that happened. They actually came on July 23rd, 1870, which is a period of time we'll talk a little bit more. And during that first year, about 600 immigrants came from Gothenburg, Sweden. If anybody knows where Gothenburg is, that's where they came from. And the story is interesting, and I'll tell you about how this came about. If I can push the right button, there we go. This guy made a big impact on that, and that's why it happened. His name is William Widgery Thomas, and he was a Bowdoin College graduate, and I think his father was a big businessman in Portland. If you've been in Portland, you heard of the Thomas Block and some of these places. And so he was a son of them, and he was appointed by Abraham Lincoln to be the consul to Sweden during the Civil War, because at that point they appointed a lot of people to go to other countries to make sure they had support for our country during the Civil War, and he was appointed a consul to Sweden. And he went there in 1861, and he was only 23 years old when he went there. So he fell in love with the country of Sweden and the type of people they had. And some of the information I have, actually, I found on the web, is a story that he wrote in 1914 about his experiences there and how he got this immigration process started. So he came back from Sweden in 1865 when the war ended, and he got into the legislature, and he put a bill in to have Swedish settlements come to Maine, as opposed to, he knew a lot when he was over to Sweden. You could see a lot of people were coming to America, but they all bypassed Maine. He said, we ought to have some coming here because there's such good stock of people, he said. And there was a couple of quotes he said. He said, here, I'll read this. He said, I presented a bill to carry out my plan to the legislature in 1869. When the bill came before the House, the member arose and said, Mr. Speaker, we have paupers enough in Maine already, and now comes Thomas and proposes to bring over a whole shipload more of them. Need I add that my bill was unanimously voted down? But he didn't give up, and he turned around and did it again in the next legislature, and he got it passed and became law. And then 2 days later, at the same time in 1870, they set up an immigration board for the state of Maine, which was to encourage immigration to Maine. So in 1870, we actually had a board of immigration, and Widgery Thomas was the first immigration official. So that was where he had his plan set, and we actually had a state board, and there was actually a commission with some funding done to encourage immigration to come to Maine. And then he sailed for Sweden, and we'll get into the rest of the story there. Now, I want to back up just a second and tell you a little bit about New Sweden and what was going on there at the time. Part of the issue is that when Aroostook County was settled, well, actually, let's go back even further. Maine became a state, and this was in 1820. It was an interesting concept. I don't know how many other states there were in the country that when they became a state, we didn't have all our boundaries set. So Maine had the state of Maine, but we didn't know our eastern boundary was. And a few years after that, about actually 20 years after that, we actually had the Aroostook War. And they had a war with Britain and Canada on where our boundary was, and they had this Webster-Ashburton Treaty and finally established a boundary in the state of Maine. So I've been doing some research on agriculture in Maine, and it's been difficult because in 1820, when Maine became a state, all the statistics only included the southern part of the state. There were no statistics for the census data for the northern part of the state because they didn't know where the boundary was, and nobody went up there to measure anything. And 40% of the agricultural land in Maine is in Aroostook County. So all the agricultural statistics before 1850, when they finally got established and started getting some records, they didn't include any of that 40% of agricultural land. So Aroostook was really a frontier. And when it actually did settle, a lot of the settlers, and I have another slide on that. I'm going to go forward and then come back, hopefully. Whoops, going the wrong way.
Mother's beard, that's quite the whiskers he's got going there.
For some reason it's going, there we go. When Aroostook County was settled, and this is getting a little broader, but I wanted to kind of give you the background. Aroostook County was settled because there wasn't anybody up there except the Acadians. And the Acadians were another story in itself, that people that were pushed out by the British when they got into Nova Scotia and Halifax, and some of them went to New Orleans, and a lot of them settled on the St. John Valley, and they had been there, and they were about the only people that populated that area. And after the Aroostook War, then the land was opened up because they built the military road from Bangor to bring the military troops up to defend the area, and they built all these towns called Fort Kent, Fort Fairfield, and all these places so that they could defend an area and determine a border line. But a lot of people that came in there, primarily, they got into potatoes fairly early, but they were mostly in timber and lumbering industries, and they were several names that they used for them. They had the Canadian-born citizens that lived in Maine, and then they had the Allagash workmen. They were mostly Irish. They were immigrants that came up and worked in the woods. It's Allagash workmen in the Allagash areas, and there's still a lot of those families up there. They were the Kennebeckers, which are people from Kennebec County, and a lot of those people, because I came from close to that area, and a lot of those family names, I know sort of names in Aroostook County that moved up after the Aroostook War and saw the nice fertile soil and land up there, and they all moved up there. And then there were Canucks, which were, they called, a lot of the Acadians were called that. And then they had the Overhomers, which were people that moved in from New Brunswick. And New Brunswick was made up of a lot of Scottish, German, and English people. And if you're familiar with history, you know that after the Revolutionary War, a lot of the Tories that were defending British and so forth, and they had to leave, they all went to Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. So there were a lot of the Englishmen that lived over there, and so those people all kind of migrated back into parts of this Aroostook County. Well, the legislature, when they went up there trying to figure out how to settle this land and develop it, they were worried about all of these people from Canada coming over and creating another border problem. So part of the issue, they wanted immigration up there and control who went in there. They wanted to make sure it was U.S. people and Maine people that settled there to make sure they could defend their border. So part of the reason they had the immigration board was to make sure that they had the people they wanted up there in the county and get it developed. So that's a little bit of the political background of why they had an immigration board and why they went to this effort to bring people up. So, so we got through all of that stuff. And to set this up, and I'll go to this on another page here, they promised the people coming to, when they went over to Sweden and looking for volunteers to come here, they promised them 100 and some odd acres of land, a cabin, and a little bit of land if they would come and settle in this area of New Sweden, which at the time when you get some free land and you get a house and you had these other things, that was a pretty good deal. And the state legislature had made a deal with the Bangor and Aroostook Railroad, who was building the railroad up there, to have some of the railroad workers work on clearing a few acres of land and having a log cabin or something for these people to move into. Well, that was all fine and dandy, but you know, working with the railroads and doing the political stuff, they got the people and the volunteers and they showed up and most of that work hadn't been done. So that was kind of how things usually work. But it's kind of an interesting story, and I'll just kind of like to follow a little bit of how these people came and how they showed up from coming to Sweden, from Sweden to New Sweden. They showed up in July of 1870 with about 60 families, and they had 6 log cabins ready for them. So 60 people showed up, a lot of families, and they only had 6 cabins, and they thought they were going to have at least 25 cabins for them. And they were supposed to have 100 acres of land with 5 acres cleared, and a lot of the acres hadn't been cleared, or if they had been cleared, their idea of cleared land and my idea of cleared land are different. I mean, they got to cut the trees down and maybe burnt the trees up, but they had basically stumps and you couldn't plant anything there, but that was what they did. But even though it was late in the year, July 23rd, they did plant turnips and harvest them in November and had some winter wheat and rye that were rented, and that's what they did to get them through the winter. So that first bunch of families, they actually end up getting 26 houses built. So they built their own houses when they got here. So they're very resourceful people, and some of the stuff that Mr. Thomas talked about was that he asked for people of good character. They had to have character references, they had to show what they could do and their skills, and he had all of this stuff they had to do in an application to come over here. So he had a pretty hand-selected group of people to come. So he also spent some time there during the summer getting these people established. So it wasn't like they just put them up in the wilderness and that was what they did. So that whole effort was kind of well coordinated, and they had a good stock of people to start. And I will say, have anybody been to New Sweden? Do we have that? We got 1, 2?
Well, rode through.
Rode through, okay, well.
Rode through.
And then, so how many people ever been to Aroostook County? Okay, we got a lot more of that, but we got a few that haven't. Well, one thing about New Sweden in the area, it's very similar to Sweden. There's a lot more hilly area. If you go through Aroostook County and drive through the area, there's a lot of open rolling fields. But when you get into New Sweden area, you're in more of the hilly country, and there's smaller fields, and there's more valleys and the rivers that go through there. And when these people settled there, they actually had more people than the town of New Sweden, or the area that they called New Sweden, could take. So they had several other towns that started. So we have Stockholm and Westmoreland, and Perham's got a lot. And there's several other towns that have Swedish names, so a lot of these Swedish families, there's just as many of them in these other towns around there. I think eventually when they got done, they had 3,000 families that came and settled in Aroostook County in these 3 or 4 towns. The population of New Sweden is only about, I think it's less than 600 right now, is what I looked up here before I came. Yeah, right here it's 580. So, and they had probably close to 1,000 at one time. So, I mean, it's still a pretty small area, but it's a very homogeneous area in terms of the families and people that are there. But anyway, their trip that they got here was interesting, and I was going to try to find that little quote that I had in terms of how they got here, if I can get my records correct, but I guess because of time I'll just paraphrase it. They left from Gothenburg on a ship and came over to what's the name of that town? Halifax on the coast. And then they took a train from Halifax up to Fredericton, And then they took another wagon train from Fredericton over to Holton and up the river to Fort Fairfield. And they settled in Fort Fairfield to start with, and they had a night stay there, and they had a big band was playing, and they had a big celebration welcoming these people. And then they took mules and horse rides and went to Caribou and stayed there a night, and then from there they went up to New Sweden. So it took them about a month for these families to go with all their possessions to settle in, get there in July and start their new life. So it was quite a long trip and a lot of effort to get there in transportation and going through areas that weren't exactly developed communities at that point in time. So that was that story in itself, which I can't locate right this minute. There is a good website called the Maine Swedish Colony .info that you could look up, and has a lot of that information on there and more information that I won't cover today. One thing that is interesting for people that are kind of history buffs, there is a two-story log cabin up there that's still around and still open some in the summertime called the Larson Olstead home. That was the only two-story log home in Maine, and one of only 2 or 3 in the whole country from that period in the 1870s that was built. So they have some nice historical buildings they've been able to maintain. Okay, let's go ahead here. I want to move forward if I can figure out how to make this work. Okay, this summary, this shows a picture today. There's a sign out in front of the town going in there in the summertime showing their colony when they started. And then this other one here was their first 100 years that they had. And they had their centennial there that they had and had a big party. And every year they have a big party up there, and they like the Swedish do that. They have the Midsummer Festival, if you're familiar with that, and they have the maypole dances. And then they have a summer concert series on the hill that's overlooking the valley where the town homes are. So they have a lot of, and they're all Swedish customs and traditions. So I have a book that I brought with me that I found, I don't know if it's been circulating or where it is. It's all in Swedish, and it's a children's book, and it has a children's story in it. And the interesting thing is that Connie's father got that when he was probably, just a few years old? Right. And it's actually signed by William Widgery Thomas, and gave to him because he was friends with the Sprague family, and they went down there at Christmas time, and he got that book at Christmas. It's a nice book, and it's historical, but I don't know how to read it because it's all in Swedish. So I was hoping we could find a Swedish person here who could read the book, but I guess I've got to look a little further to find that. Okay, and then let's see, get that one. In 1870 to 1895, in that 25-year period, New Sweden, Stockholm, and those areas had a tremendous amount of growth. This is a picture in about 1890, I think it is, in New Sweden, in the village, and it's kind of down where the river goes through the middle. And it shows a lot of land there and a lot of buildings, churches, and there was a lot of sawmills and timber mills going, and a lot of the farmers in New Sweden did the same thing they did in Sweden. They were all very self-sufficient farmers, and they raised a lot of things that they could take care of themselves. So when the country went through the Depression and other things in the 1930s and so forth, New Sweden actually did quite well because they were all still very self-sufficient, very close-knit community, and they prospered pretty well during the Depression years when a lot of other people didn't do so well. So even their isolation and their Sweden stock of being self-sufficient and doing things yourself and whatever worked very well, and that's one reason that community still is very homogeneous in Swedish stock there now. And so you can go up there, and I could take that book up, and I could probably find in a half hour, I could find several people that could read it because they keep their language up and their customs up. But it was kind of a development as kind of looks like a Wild West uniform. And actually quite a few of the people, and I was reading a little bit about the different families, some of them came from the Midwest, came back after they went out to the Midwest from Sweden. They heard about the Swedish people settling in Maine, and some of them came back from there and settled up there and got into farming and a few other issues. This is a picture from the New Sweden Historical Society of one of the very first log cabins that were built. It was one of the few remaining ones from the original ones that were built, but that's what they had. I think it was 18 by 26 feet wide, and like say 2 or 3 families would live in that one room building when they first settled there. And some of the other buildings that were with them, they'd put all their supplies and their food stocks in the other ones. So even though they had more buildings, they had to have a place to put their food and supplies and one thing or another. So they just whole bunch of families would crowd into these the first years until they could build the other ones. So pretty hardy stock in what they had. And one of the other pictures I wanted to show, when they said they cleared land so these settlers would have a place to work, that's a picture of what they call cleared land. I wouldn't want to have to grow too many crops in that area. The guy's got a plow here. I don't know if I can use this thing or not. It's kind of interesting. But there's a plow there, one-horse plow, and he's trying to plow that area. Well, I don't see much place I could go with a horse to try to get anything plowed up, but that's what they were planting their crops in. And I don't know if that fog in the background is smoke, because they burnt a lot of the trees down to open the ground up so they could get at some cropland. So that's what these families did when they settled in here. They had these little tiny houses and hovels, so-called cleared land, and that's what they were going to stake their life on and learn how to be farmers. And then that kind of crop. The only good news is that land up there in Aroostook County was very fertile soil, pretty good quality soil, so they were able to make a success of it. But it just shows the kind of hardy stock and kind of the things that the people had to do when they got started. So that was just a picture I had of that area, and it's around 1880, so it's actually about 10 years after they arrived in 1870 something, and they tried to clear some land and keep clearing it and move in. So it's quite a story on that area. I guess right now, because I've kind of got a lot of different things here, any questions? I know I've covered a lot of material real quickly, but does anybody have any questions or something that they heard they wanted some other explanation on? Yeah.
I wondered, was immigration at that time controlled by the states rather than the federal control that we have now?
Well, I think people coming in still had to come through Ellis Island and Boston, and a few came from Portland, but mostly Boston and Ellis Island. But no, the states could support and encourage that, and remember at that period of time there was still a huge amount of effort to settle the West. So there were all kinds of land policies. I think the Homestead Act was passed during the Civil War, and that was an effort to get land settled and moved out, and people settled out west. That's partly a result of that. Some of the land-grant colleges came to kind of develop the area. So a lot of that was federal policy, but they didn't have an immigration policy per se. And this is one example where they actually encouraged immigration, where in a few years beyond this, they got into periods of time when they were trying to discourage immigration, when they had a lot of the anti-Irish and Catholic movements and things of this nature that were going on in Maine. The know-nothings that came up, this was all a result, and that was kind of a negative backlash to it. But during this period, right after the Civil War, you got to remember a lot of people had died in the Civil War. Maine had a huge number of people that went to the Civil War and they didn't come back. It was one of the largest percentages of the population that died during that period of time. So a lot of the farmers, farm families, there was a labor shortage in here, and we also were doing the Industrial Revolution, building a lot of plants and factories that needed a lot of labor, and we didn't have it. So immigration and supporting people moving to the state was a high priority. So all of that stuff occurred, so that was part of the initiative. This was just an isolated case where they did it for a reason to get in that area of the state settled, but they were also encouraging and making provisions to get people settled in, like the Bates Mill and Lewiston, Auburn, and Biddeford Saco mills. But most of those were initiatives done by the local mill owners that wanted the labor. So there were a lot of things going on at that time that created that need for it. But this was just, and when they got this settled and they got done, they basically abolished the Immigration Board after that happened. So that was interesting. Another little interesting point is that the governor at the time that initiated this Immigration Board and appointed Widgery Thomas to be on that board, the governor was Joshua Chamberlain. He had come back from the Civil War, and that was his first term as governor of Maine. So just to let you know, there's another name that kind of throws up there at that time.
I love how the picture is in the bottom right corner is a child, a baby. And the dog is guarding it.
Yeah, and there's some sheep or some animals over there, sheep or pigs, I can't tell what. Some of these old photographs, like I said, the interesting thing is you can get some history of these things. You can't get much history till 1850 or 60 because photograph really wasn't established till about 1830, and we didn't have any official state photographer till almost 1850, 1840 something. So anybody that took pictures of this is a pretty rare thing to have pictures taken. So if you can find these old photographs, especially in the 1880s, 1890s. Once 1900 came, there were a lot more photographs available and companies that were actually taking pictures of buildings and businesses and so forth. But some of these early pictures are hard to come by. So it's hard to really visualize and see some of the conditions that existed.
It's interesting to think about the use, I mean, one of the things I love about going up to the county is that you get up on, you know, your rolling hills and you get up on the top and it's just endless, open forever, and so beautiful, especially in the spring when the potatoes are blooming. That's one of my very favorite, if you ever have a chance to go when the potatoes are blooming, it's absolutely gorgeous. You go up over some hill and you can see for miles and the potato fields are just absolutely beautiful, but it's interesting to think that it wasn't always that way.
Well, the interesting thing too, to bring that point forward, if you talk about the development of agriculture in Maine, and this is, I've done a lot of research on this, in southern part of Maine they had just hand tools and they settled 100 and some odd years before Worcester County was settled.
Yeah.
So they had an oxen and an axe and that's what they cleared land with. By the time 1850s and 60s rolled around, they had teams of horses and they had more equipment and they had more labor and they had the Canadians that come over and help that they could hire. Instead of clearing 3 or 4 acres a year like the first settlers in Maine did and had these little small fields in southern Maine, they could clear 100 acres in a year up there with the equipment that they had once they got going. So New Sweden was a little different because they kind of stepped to themselves and did this, but a lot of that land that's open there was all woods like this when it first started. But because of the terrain being open, it was a lot easier to open the land up. But they developed a lot larger fields and a lot larger farms a lot quicker because of when it was settled and when it was developed. So it was a timing issue and technology issue a little bit. It made for a different kind of agriculture up there. So, but it is an interesting place to visit. New Stockholm people are very friendly and there's some beautiful scenery and there's a nice museum up there that they have. And a little sidelight, and I didn't prepare for this, but if anybody read the paper, remember there was about, I think it was 2003, there was a poisoning in a church in New Sweden.
Yeah.
Remember that? There was a person, they didn't like somebody in the church, so they poured some arsenic in the coffee and some people died and some other people were seriously sick. Got national attention, so it was the most attention New Sweden had ever gotten. And they think they figured out who did it, but he committed suicide before they could figure it out. So, but there's several churches. I think there's 3 churches left up there. Lutheran is the big one, but they're very church-centered in their activities, and that was a real shock to the community because of the closeness of the people to that community. So, but just shows that even with a close-knit community, there's problems. All right, well, yes.
I went to a town in Kansas, Lindsborg, I believe.
Okay.
And that was a Swedish development also.
Yeah, that was one of the states that was said to have a big Swedish village. You know, Minnesota, Illinois, Kansas, Nebraska, they all settled in that area when they first started. I guess the very first ones came in the Delaware and Pennsylvania area. But so they become, you got 37,000 a year coming for 10 years, so you can spread them out quite a ways around the country. So there's quite a Swedish population around. So, and they all have the names that are very distinctive. So, but anyway, any other questions? Well, I thank you for your time and hope you enjoyed it. So,
Get one a beer.
yes, yes, one more question.
I think your wife is, did your grandfather, grandmother come over with the original settlers?
They both came over from Gothenburg.
My grandmother was 4 years old when she came over
Oh my
in
gosh.
1870.
It would have been about that time. Did she
Yeah.
go to Portland?
She went to New Sweden.
Oh my
The whole
gosh.
family came. And she was the last surviving settler. I have some papers with me today that go back
Oh.
to the different celebrations they had. They had a big 10th celebration. And they're having a 150th celebration in New Sweden in 2020, next year. So they're advertising it on, they have websites set up. And I was born in Caribou, but all of my relatives were in New Sweden.
Oh my
So all of this is really familiar to me. The picking potatoes, and I always said to my sons, and I picked 73 barrels one day, and my son said, Mom, we've heard that story so many times.
Well, you tell them if you ever picked 73 barrels of potatoes in a day, you'd be telling the story a long time.
For 23 cents a barrel.
Yeah.
What was your family name?
Anderson,
That's mine too.
and
Well, maybe you're
we
related.
related.
Your cousins.
And my father came over from Sweden in 1910 from Sweden. That family came over and settled.
What was your dad's name?
Egan Espling,
Oh, I've heard the name Espling up here.
and my great-grandfather's name was Nicholas Classe, and he was the one that was put in charge, so to speak, of the 51 settlers that came over. And it's just a really interesting for me heritage. I'm very close to my heritage, and we celebrate. I have to go home. I've lived down here for many years, but home is in Caribou, New Sweden. It's just not that I could live up there right now, but
They won the
It's a-
basketball championship.
they won. They won.
That's a great story.
So I gotta ask you, have you ever had lutefish?
Yes.
Oh.
An aquavit?
No. But I didn't. No, I didn't like that.
Hardly anybody I know does.
Scandinavian cooking, but and we still have it in our house. We make the inlegsill and the inlegsill and the sulta. We have it every year
Yeah.
at our house, and it's just we have wonderful memories of our heritage. The historical society, the historical building that is there now, has only been there since, I would say, the mid-70s, because the original building burned down in 71. My father and I went up. I got everything out of that original museum. But my uncle designed, Henry Anderson was my uncle, and he designed the museum that is standing there now and lived long enough to see it dedicated.
Oh, my goodness.
Wasn't there a ski race, a Henry Anderson ski race?
Yes,
too?
and I think there still is.
Yes, I do too.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think the two of you are probably cousins.
Well, I also have
Need
an
to do
uncle,
the
Henry
research.
Anderson, but it wouldn't be the same person, but.
You know, maybe it
And they
is.
have there's a beautiful music bowl that you had mentioned,
Yeah.
and it's on a hill, and
Thomas Park.
I've played many concerts in that music bowl in the summertime where my uncle directed the band.
Wow.
So you should go up there.
I believe that the University of Maine had Maynard Sharon has a son that lives in Sweden, Sweden the country, and married a Swedish girl, and I guess he's going back over there for a Swedish wedding this summer. But he said the University of Maine here actually had a graduate student that did a history of New Sweden and did a video on it, and he got a copy of it, and they were marveling at that and in Sweden because the dialect is so much different from the Swedish dialect, so they were looking at that. But there's also a video I found on Facebook about a visit to Sweden, and there's an old guy that comes back there and he talks in Swedish the whole time, and they have subtitles on it, and he's got that Swedish dialect, and it shows because Tom mentioned that they had, for a long time, they'd have Swedish newspapers, and they'd actually get them out of Chicago to get the papers to get news back home, and they get these things in some of these log cabins. They've got walls here now that they use for the insulation on the walls, these old newspapers that are all in Swedish. They came from Chicago, they're sitting on these walls in there. So it is kind of an interesting trip back there and see how people lived and communicated and did things. So it's a fascinating, and it's so homogeneous, it isn't diluted by all our other modern day things as much, so you can still get a good flavor of what that life was like back then by visiting there, because it is isolated and that kind of helps maintain it. So it's really a nice trip, and there are some videos so that those people that can't travel up there anymore can get a good flavor of that.
Imagine how long it took to get that paper there.
Yes,
Yeah.
I don't think it was yesterday's news.
And
Yeah.
also, my grandmother's 9-month-old sister, who made the trip, passed away on the trip. And they embalmed her, and she was the first burial in New Sweden. And there's a big cemetery next to the historical building. But the first cemetery, you would have to walk down through the woods, and that's where she was buried, right after they landed in New Sweden. So,
Yeah, that's actually written up on the historical site website, that person's name and how that child, and they carried that baby for probably 4 or 5 days through the woods until they got to New Sweden so they could bury her and have a cemetery, a funeral service for that person. So, okay, very good. Yes?
You mentioned that you do a lot of the traditions. What type of traditions do you carry on?
Well, we always have a Swedish smorgasbord at Christmas Eve. That's a tradition. And we always talk about the Tolkens, the Swedish gnomes or Christmas spirit. Tomten, I guess, Tolkien. She's Swedish, I'm not. So.
Yeah. Putting the nut in the pudding at Christmas time.
Oh, yeah?
is You
Yeah,
reach
that-
in to get some of the pudding, and then whoever gets the nut, that's supposed to represent a year of good luck coming your way.
Okay.
And the little ones in our family love that. Oh my gosh, that's big.
It's so nice that they do carry on. these
Exactly,
traditions.
exactly.
And they have the St. Lucia Festival at Christmas time on the shortest day of the year. That's a few weeks
Well, it's
before
December
Christmas.
13th.
Yeah, December 13th. And they have the girl wearing the wreath with the candle sticking out of it. That's the St. Lucia person. They come around and have a ceremony. And they have special Swedish cookies or
Swedish
something with
buns
that.
in bed, yeah.
So they have several of those traditions that they talk about. And there's a good painter, author, Eric Larsson, I believe. He's got some beautiful painter, and he's got a lot of scenes of Swedish life in Sweden. Carl Larsson is his name. Okay. And a few of those prints tell you a lot about Swedish. And there's a couple Swedish stores. What's this one down in downtown Portland by the Nickelodeon?
Scandinavian shop.
That's Scandinavian. They have a lot of Swedish books and Swedish
Jewelry,
materials and
foods.
things too.
Also Monica's
Yes.
terrible.
Oh, yeah. This was from Monica's. Yes.
I love you already.
That's because you're related.
Well, with that, we probably should break up so they can talk, so we can get done. So I thank you all for your time, and hope you learned something today and enjoyed it.